I never believed a single truck could carry so much dread until I was assigned Truck 19. On paper, it was just another compactor, heavy steel, worn paint, a working life built on hauling refuse from forgotten roads and back alleys. I took the job because it kept me on the move, fed me, and gave me reasons to sleep deep at night. But someone should have warned me about Truck 19. Someone should have told me what people whispered when they thought no one was listening. No one did, and I learned the truth the hard way. I first climbed onto the side railings of that truck 6 months ago. They call it riding shotgun, but there's nothing glamorous about hanging onto steel bars while asphalt rushes past at 70 miles an hour. Some guys ride for hours with nothing but the hum of the engine and thoughts that go too quiet, too fast. I wasn't new to long hauls, but I was new to this rig, and from the very first day something felt off. Not immediately, not in a chill down your spine way, but like a pressure you couldn't see that pressed against your shoulders and whispered too softly to register until your mind demanded it make sense. Most days passed like any other. I'd crawl up onto that step just after sunrise, grab onto the rails, and watch the small stuff of life flick by like an old film reel. Families loading groceries, stray cats darting across parking lots, trees rustling like they were whispering something I couldn't hear. I kept notes in my head, road conditions, strip mall backdrops, patterns of sunlight, anything to stay grounded, to stay normal. But every so often I'd catch something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement that didn't belong to the truck, or a reflection in a rear mirror that looked too long, too sharp to be mundane. The first few times I ignored it. I told myself it was fatigue, imagination. Trucking long hours ruins your sense of time, your sense of reality. But the longer I did the job, the more raw those small moments became. Then there was Robert. I found his tooth lodged in the wall of the truck about 3 months in. I was half asleep in the cab, coffee in hand, staring at the dashboard when I noticed it gleam like an odd souvenir. I reached out and pried it loose, expecting it to be something we picked up from the roadside. Maybe a bit of trash embedded in grime, but it wasn't just debris. It was a human tooth, perfectly intact, enamel yellowed but unmistakably human. I took it inside the cab, holding it between my fingers as Joe, the driver I rode with, looked at it and didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. He simply said, "That's one of Robert's." I had no idea who Robert was, and Joe didn't elaborate, but the way he held that tooth, like a relic of someone he knew well, made my skin crawl. Joe was quiet after that. In the cab, he kept his eyes forward, knuckles white on the wheel. Every so often, he'd glance at the tooth sitting on the dashboard, barely touching it as though afraid to disturb something that had already been disturbed once. I tried to ask about Robert, who he was, why his tooth was in the wall of Truck 19, but Joe only muttered that they'd been friends, that Robert liked riding back there, that he always said he felt alive up on the rails, closer to something real. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, like the memory itself a bitter thing to taste again. I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation, but something about the way his eyes avoided mine said there wasn't. A few miles down the road, the guy riding in back with us wasn't there anymore, just empty rails, like he'd evaporated into the air. I called out to Joe, my voice echoing in the cab, and he didn't respond for a long minute. Then he said, "I think we might have a problem." I climbed down to check. The pavement behind us was stained dark, the scent heavy and unmistakably iron. I didn't want to see it, but there was no mistake. Blood, splattered in a pattern too sudden to be anything but violent. I turned back to the cab. Joe wasn't there either. It was just me, the truck rolling onward like nothing had happened. That was the moment I knew this was no ordinary job. I stayed with Truck 19 because I needed the pay. I couldn't quit. There were bills, responsibilities, and an insistence in me that refusing to understand something was worse than understanding it. But the more miles we logged, the more I saw that the truck wasn't content hauling refuse. It collected stories, scraps of humanity, bits of flesh that didn't belong in the back where garbage was supposed to be. Once, I found a child's shoe wedged into the compactor's wall, scuffed, tiny, and impossibly out of place. Joe shrugged it off like it was trash we'd picked up by accident. I wanted to argue, but fear sat heavy on my tongue. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words turned sour. One night, the compactor's engine spluttered and died on an isolated stretch where the road dissolved into fields of darkness. I climbed down to inspect it, tools in hand, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night like a blade. In that beam, I saw footprints, not the typical tire tread marks or human boot imprints, but something else. Deep, elongated starts and stops, as though something tall, heavy, and uneven had walked beside the truck. My breath hitched. I shouldn't have gotten out of the cab, but I couldn't turn away from those prints, leading away from the road and into a shadowed tree line that pulsed like something alive in the darkness. I froze there, listening, and for the first time I wondered if I'd ever made it home. The rustle of leaves wasn't wind. It was too deliberate, too measured. Then I saw it, a shape, tall and indistinct, its outline barely forming in the cracks between trees. My heart pounded so loud it felt like footsteps in my skull. I stumbled back toward the truck, only to see something else, the light of Joe's phone flickering inside the cab, even though he wasn't supposed to be there. I climbed in with trembling hands, closed the door and locked it. The dashboards lit up on their own. No key in the ignition, no engine running, just a display of numbers that didn't correspond to anything I understood, like data from a machine I'd never seen before. I drove until sunrise, the compactor humming like it had a will of its own. I tried explaining all of this to dispatch, but they asked if I was sure I was awake, if fatigue might be messing with my senses. They suggested I take a break. I told them no, I was riding farther, but every mile felt heavier, every dawn felt colder. I began to notice changes in myself, nightmares that felt too vivid to be dreams, hands that trembled even during sunlight hours, eyes that caught movement in places no human ought to see. I told myself these were psychological shadows of the job. I wanted those shadows to be the explanation, but they weren't. Something real stalked me on that truck, something more primal than fear, something that didn't just ride behind us. It was part of the ride. Most of the time, the back of truck 19 was empty. When it wasn't, the sounds were unnatural. Distant screeches, heavy breaths, the scraping of metal against something softer. I saw shadows darting past the trailer in split seconds, too fast to be animals, too fluid to be windblown debris. Once I thought I saw a face in the semi's rearview camera, pale, elongated sunken eyes fixed on me with something that looked disturbingly like fascination. I looked away before it blinked. I tell myself I didn't imagine it. I didn't want to believe I did. But the memory sits there, solid as the steel rails beneath my hands, whispering that maybe it was real. There was no turning back after that. The truck drove not just on roads, but through the edges of my perception, dragging something out of the dark where it waited. I began hearing footsteps behind me at night, not in my house, just in the silence after sleep. When I woke, I'd find deep scratches on my arms, marks I couldn't place. I blamed mix-ups and stress until one night I dreamt I was hanging onto a rail and felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, pulling. I woke screaming, drenched in sweat, my collar soaked. It took me hours to convince myself I was in bed and not strapped to the side of that truck. Now I ride every week. Every mile brings new stories, scraps of items too odd to be garbage, strange stains I can't explain, shadows that follow the cab in your peripheral vision but vanish when you look directly. I hear the other drivers speak in hushed tones about truck 19. They call it cursed, haunted, alive. Some say the riders who went missing didn't fall off. Some say they were taken. I don't know which is worse. What I do know is this: the truck doesn't just carry refuse. It carries parts of people, bits of soul and bone and fear that cling to its fixtures like barnacles on a hole. And every night when I climb up those rails and grab the cold metal, I can feel the weight of every story that truck has collected, like an echo of those who never got down. And I understand now why so many drivers whisper its number with dread, why they avoid it, why they say without really explaining, don't ride on truck 19, because once you do, you never fully leave it behind. Before we continue, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? I never meant to take that midnight call. When the phone rang so late, I assumed it was a wrong number, a crank call, or someone drunk and unreachable on the other line. But the voice, calm, deliberate, terribly human, said a single sentence that changed everything. I'm stuck. I need help. And the tone wasn't panic. It was conviction. That's what made me answer. I was living alone then, a freelance documentary producer, always chasing stories that bordered on the strange but believable, local legends, abandoned hospitals, old forest cabins. I wasn't looking for a horror story, not in my own life, but the man on the other end of the line gave me an address, a rural route I'd never heard of, and a timestamp, 3:14 a.m. Don't come too early, he had said. I'm not ready. I laughed, a nervous, hollow sound, and promised I would come. I left my house at 1:47 a.m., driving through empty streets with only the hum of tires and the streetlights flickering against the windshield. I should have turned back when the GPS recalculated the route 3 times, switching between old logging roads and dead ends, but I kept going. There was something in his voice that pulled me forward, a blend of fear and curiosity that maybe only a storyteller could understand. The road narrowed, trees closed in. The occasional deer darted across the asphalt, their eyes shining like beacons in my headlights. I checked the call again. No new messages, no texts, no missed calls. Just the strange silence on the other end, like he'd hung up and waited instead. The address brought me eventually to a cul-de-sac that led nowhere, surrounded by forest so thick it looked like night, even in full moonlight. I parked at the edge and stepped out of my car. The air was unnaturally still. I half expected him to appear from the shadows, drip panicked apologies, tell me I came too late or too early. But there was nothing at first, just my breath against the cold, the crunch of gravel underfoot, and that wide stretch of darkness. I raised the camera and started recording instinctively, narrating what I saw. Empty road, broken pavement, no houses in sight, no lights other than my own. Then I heard a distant shuffle, a footstep, someone moving, almost timid in the forest. I called out, "Hello? Are you there?" My voice felt small in the giant emptiness. The footstep didn't answer. It walked closer, crunching fallen leaves, deliberate yet hesitant. I felt my heartbeat accelerate, every nerve screaming that this wasn't just a man wandering in the woods. But another voice answered, not the voice from the phone, but a whisper so close it felt like it brushed my ear. "I'm here." I spun around, raising the camera, but all I saw at first was blackness between the trees. Then a figure stepped forward, hood pulled low, silhouette pale in the moonlight. He didn't speak, just stood there, watching. My skin crawled. The instinct to flee battled with my urge to understand. "Are you the one who called?" I asked, voice steadying. The figure nodded slowly, as if almost remembering something it had forgotten. "I need help," he said, voice barely above a whisper. And that voice, the timbre, the cadence. It was exactly the same as the one on the phone. I took a hesitant step toward him. "What happened?" I asked. He raised a trembling hand and pointed deeper into the woods, toward a narrow trail barely visible among the roots and shadows. "She's there," he said. "She needs help." My stomach dropped. I didn't know who she was, but his eyes, hollow, glazed, unsettling, said urgency. I clicked the recorder on. "Stay here," I told him. He nodded again. I stepped onto the trail, and the forest seemed to swallow me whole. The moonlight dimmed, the trees pressing closer like sentinels indifferent to my existence. Every footstep felt heavier than the last. My breath came in shallow bursts. My eyes scanned every movement, every flicker of shadow that might explain the unease pooling in my chest. After only a few hundred meters, I heard it, a quiet sob, rhythmic, almost resigned. I called out again, no answer. The sobbing stopped. Silence. I turned, gripping the camera tighter, heart pounding. That's when the snapping began. Not distant, not subtle, abrupt, precise, like something big forcing its way through brush just beyond my field of vision. I turned the recorder toward the sound, my voice shaking as I tried to narrate it. Then a chilling silence followed. The forest seemed to hold its breath. When the sobbing started again, it wasn't ahead of me. It was behind me, near where I'd entered the trail. I spun around, and in the faint glow of moonlight, I saw him, the man from the road, crouched beside a motionless shape, swaddled in blankets, face hidden. I hurried toward them, calling out, but my feet felt like lead. The closer I got, the more distorted everything felt, like viewing the world through a lens that warps reality. He looked up at me and whispered, "She needs help." My pulse was deafening in my ears. I knelt beside the shape, reached out tentatively, and when I brushed the blanket aside, I saw her face. Pale, eyes open wide, but blank, not breathing. Yet her chest flickered almost imperceptibly. I checked for a pulse. It was faint, too faint. I turned to the man for answers, but his expression was unreadable, hollow, as though he was watching something I couldn't see. I reached for my phone to dial emergency services. No signal. Not even a dot of connectivity. The forest around us seemed to flicker with static improbability, as if it wanted to erase anything that didn't belong. I turned back to her, the woman, and she let out a gurgling breath, her eyes locking onto mine. Her lips moved, trying to form a word. I leaned in closer, and I heard it, half coherent. He wasn't here to help. My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, staring at the man who brought me here. His shoulders twitched, his head tilted, eyes unfocused, and that same whisper crawled into my ears. He wasn't here to help. I could feel it not just in sound, but in my spine, soaking into my nerves like ice. I turned toward the trail entrance and began to run, dragging the woman behind me. Trees whipped past as my breath ripped in and out. Behind me, the sobbing began again, low, urgent, but not human. It was deeper,
mournful in a way that seemed engineered to make the marrow in your bones ache. My grip tightened on her arm. I had no idea how I would save her, but I knew staying there was a death sentence. We tripped out of the woods and back onto the road. I looked around desperately for the man who called me, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no sound, just wind in the trees, and the woman's weak rasp for air. I frantically waved down a passing truck, red headlights approaching like a promise. But as it drew nearer, the lights morphed in the darkness, flickering in unnatural rhythm, until they disappeared altogether. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise I'd heard before. I set her down gently near the roadside, reached for my phone again. Still no signal. I scanned the dark horizon, hoping to see another vehicle, another soul, anything. Then I felt it, a presence behind me, not near, not expanded, just an awareness, something watching. I turned slowly and realized the forest edge had shifted. It wasn't where it had been just moments before. The shadows seemed deeper, denser, as though the trees themselves leaned in closer. I backed away, breath trembling. I called out, half to the forest, half to the woman beside me, but no sound came back. A second presence approached, slower, deliberate, footsteps that didn't disturb leaves, didn't crunch twigs. Then a voice I recognized came from the dark, low and metallic in tone. "You shouldn't have come here." My eyes widened. I tried to move, but my legs felt weighted, like the road itself resisted my escape. The voice repeated, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. He wasn't here to help. I realized then that the call had never been a request for assistance. It was a lure, a beacon to draw someone in. Someone curious, prepared to investigate. It wasn't fear in that whisper. It was intention. It wanted to be seen, observed, drawn in. I tried to scream, but the words never came. My last thought before the darkness closed in was that I should have hung up the phone. I should have ignored that voice, and above all, I should have known that help doesn't come at 3:14 a.m. in the middle of nowhere. And that's when I understood what those final words meant. He wasn't there to help. He was there to replace you.
If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And tell us in the comments which part scared you the most, and drop your ideas in the comments. Your idea might be our next nightmare.